We're uncovering thought-provoking, life-changing truths straight from Cleveland to the world. We're modern-day hope dealers, and we're proud of it.
Welcome to the Substance TV podcast, where it's all about the conversation. Provocative issues, life hacks, and designing a legacy is what matters most. And now, your hosts, Jason Howard and Brian Del Turco.
Hey, Substance TV, Jason Howard here with my co-host.
Hey, Brian Del Turco here. Today's going to be exciting.
Oh, today's going to be awesome because we are following up with who we were talking to last week. And
Melissa.
These two are incredible. Garry and Melissa Ingraham, they are awesome. They have actually changed a lot of lives. Their lives have been changed, but they've been doing a lot of life changing. God is working through them powerfully. I cannot wait for you to hear Garry's story. Melissa's story was off the hook last week. So if you listened last week, you're going to love this week. And if you have not listened to last week, you need to go back and you need to listen to Melissa's story. Melissa's Garry's wife, off the hook story of her. I'm not even going to spoil it. I'm just going to leave it at that. You need to go back and check it out. But Garry and Melissa have been married for 11 years, and they are proud parents of two amazing boys that we just got to meet a little while ago. They're adorable. And Melissa, she is a licensed mental health counselor in New York and Arizona. She's the wife, of course, of Garry, and that's who we were interviewing last week.
Yeah, we're going to hear from Garry today. He's the founder and executive director of Love and Truth Network. It's a nonprofit equipping Christian leaders on developing safe and transformational environments for men, women, and youth within the church that are caught up in the epidemic of sexual sin and relational brokenness. There's a great need in the church, Jason, isn't there?
There's a whole lot of that.
The church is largely dropping the ball on this.
Yes, and that's why we've got to talk about this stuff. We got to expose, right, and bring things to the light. And so, Garry, thank you so much to you, your sweet little wife. I know that right now you could be with the boys and you've got plenty to do, but you're with us. And so, on behalf of Brian and I and our Substance TV family, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, clearly your wife knocked it out of the park, and you are joining... You're joining us and a lot of other guys who have married up, clearly, sharp ladies that are just thebomb.com. But we got to tell you, Garry, we're pumped to talk to you because we think you're pretty freaking sharp yourself, and you've done some neat things for the Lord. You're doing great things for the Lord, but you have an incredible story that I think is so pertinent for the church as is, but for so many people that aren't darkening the door of a church and would never want to step foot in a church for whatever reason. God is working through you for those folks as well. And so would you just kind of begin to jump right into this story of yours, begin to unpack it, and would you allow us maybe even at certain times to jump in and just ask questions along the way?
Oh, that's great. Love that.
Okay, cool. Yep. All right, well, we're going to shut up and get out of the way.
Well, so when I'm sharing my story, I usually just start off by mentioning that both my mom and dad came into their marriage quite relationally broken. My mom's dad passed away when she was about 5 years old. Her family went on welfare, and welfare back in that time was pretty severe and just really riddled with shame. And so her family was very, very poor. Her mom went into a deep depression and had just had another baby when he died. And she would be rocking in the same chair when they went to school and still in the same spot when they came home. And so there was just a lot of brokenness there. My dad's mother left his dad back when he was about 5 or 6 years old. And for some reason, I don't know, back in that day, it seems like children were really treated like trash when parents divorced. I don't know what that was all about, but it seemed like they were sort of considered to be, I don't know, dirty or from a bad background or whatever, and they just kind of bore the brunt. But my dad, along with his siblings, were farmed out to relatives while his father was trying to get his life back together and eventually remarried. But all that time, they're with relatives that really didn't want them. And so anyway, my mom and dad met when they were in their late teens, I believe it was maybe 17 and 19 or 18 and 20, and got married 2 months after they met, which as a former pastor, I would be highly criticizing the idea of getting married 2 months after they met. But they stayed together and were married 68 years. My dad passed away in 88. But my experience was that of I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and my next oldest sibling is 5 years older than me. And my parents thought they were done having children. And so at the age of 41, my mom finds out that she's pregnant, and nobody was happy about that. My mom wasn't. My dad was especially not happy about that. He was a heavy equipment operator, and we didn't have a lot of money either as a family. But also he was pretty jealous of the time that my mom was giving and the emotional energy my mom was giving to the kids as well. So to have another one coming along, when they thought they were, going to be done at some point. So the reality is that I was unplanned for, and I wasn't wanted. And when I was born, my mom certainly came around to loving me well, but my dad really didn't so much. I mean, it isn't that he didn't love me. I'm sure that he did, but he was still just frustrated and angry about having another screaming, kid in the house. And it wasn't until much later in life that my dad and I developed a really phenomenal relationship. I mean, before he died, we lived together for about 15 years. My parents lived with me, and I got to take care of them. And my dad died on hospice in our home, and I took care of him right up to the end of that. I wouldn't trade it for anything. We really developed a strong bond. But even though we had developed a strong bond much later in life, it did not repair all the damage that was done throughout my developmental years as a kid. And so only Jesus can do that, can go back and because he's not bound by time, to be able to go back and really repair those things. And so about the age of 5 or 6, I was in kindergarten or first grade. And I remembered, and I was very shy. I was horribly shy as a child. I was full of shame. I remember when I was the very first day of school, when the school bus came. We lived out in the country in upstate New York, and the school bus came, and my somebody, my mom, my dad, whoever, my siblings, I literally had both of my hands on either side of the bus door, trying not to get on the bus. I mean, the social anxiety was profound, and they're just shoving me as I'm screaming and wailing, and so that was kind of my entry into the public school experience and onto the bus. And of course, I'm like raw meat for the bullies. They're like, oh, good, this kid's going to be fun, right? So throughout all of my, both in my school experience as well as in church and even within my family, I have 3 older brothers. There was just a lot of, especially at school, just a lot of bullying and name calling and just this feeling every day of having to go to a place where I didn't know what was going to happen, and I hated being there. And so one day, as I started to say earlier, in kindergarten or first grade, some older neighborhood boys came back and asked me if I wanted to come over and play with them. Well, I didn't get that kind of invitation, that I was never asked to do anything. For sports, I was, the last one chosen for a team, and usually offered by that team to the other team to please take me, that kind of thing. And so I was excited, went home, changed my clothes, went over to this house, this neighbor down the road. And the boys, the reason they asked me is because their mom and dad weren't home, and they knew where their dad's hardcore stash was at. So at about 5 or 7 years of age, 5 or 6 years of age, they pulled out the stuff and started flipping page after page after page for me to look at. And I was stunned. I mean, it was a grand time for them, but I couldn't even quite process what I was looking at in many respects. But then after the pornography stuff, they also engaged in some homosexual behavior too. And it gets really fuzzy for me at that point. I don't know if I was involved or if I was just present or what, but the reality is when I left that home, that place, that day, I was a very different boy than I was when I went there. I mean, there was already lots of damage. There was already lots of shame. There was already lots of confusion and the deep sense of being unwanted and being unplanned for. And I mean, you can be unplanned for and be a happy surprise, but again, it wasn't that. So so several things happened. One is shame set in even deeper. There was another, I'd say, deeper wedge that went into between my parents and I. Just this feeling of dirtiness, this feeling of I can't talk with them. My dad wasn't safe, certainly, to talk with. And then I would also say, then there was also because I have these legitimate God-given needs for love and affection from my dad, as well as others too, certainly. But I had this huge void. And so there was something that really powerfully started to happen in terms of having, my own sexuality and sexual awareness awakened at such an early age. There was, again, this weird combination of feeling dirty and put off by it, but yet being drawn to it. So when I hit puberty, I was a porn addict. I mean, I would go to, of course, you couldn't get online. There wasn't such a thing back then, but I would go to stores and kind of seek ways of getting my hands on it. And there was a family moved into our neighborhood a couple years later with an couple year older boy in the family. And we were just friends for a couple of years. And then that shifted into a sexual relationship with him, and went on off and on for 2 or 3 years. And all this time I'm going to church. I mean, my parents were involved in church every Sunday, usually Wednesday nights, and many other times as well. And so part of my experience was growing up at a church and hearing lots of truth, but but the modeling both at home and at the church stunk. I mean, of course it wasn't all bad. I don't mean to say that. It wasn't all bad, but I think it's John Maxwell, I think, is the one that coined the phrase that more is caught than taught. And so I'm hearing all kinds of truth, but I'm observing people are using these words, but their actions don't match up to those words. Yeah. What I began to believe, looking back now, I see it very clearly. I believed that God was this ogre, or this slave master that demands we love him. Like, there's nothing loving about him. He's just full of rules, do's and don'ts. And somehow in the midst of all that, we're supposed to love him. And so, I sort of tried my best to do that, but I didn't like him. I mean, I really hated God. But I was terrified of going to hell. And so, as a Baptist church I grew up in, so I prayed the sinner's prayer, and it's supposed to be once and done, right? So I prayed the sinner's prayer and prayed it multiple times because I knew something wasn't taking. And ultimately, I mean, I didn't come to surrender my life to Christ until my early 20s. I mean, people assumed I was a Christian because I went to church. I didn't know what more to do than what I was doing. Mm-hmm. But the piece that was missing was surrender. And I wasn't surrendering because I didn't like God. I wanted my ticket out of hell. I wanted fire insurance, essentially, but I really don't want you having anything to do with my life in terms of leading it, because I don't like the people that are, connected with you. So wow. Eventually I bounced around from homeschool to public school to Christian school, and then wound up at a local Christian college early. I finished homeschooling early, and so I was there kind of the tail end of my 16th year. And I just went with all kinds of emotional baggage, no one to unpack any of it with. A couple of years earlier, I had tried to have a conversation with my pastor, which was terrifying to me. But he and I were alone after one Sunday, and again, I was just, masturbation and pornography and sexual sin with this other guy in the neighborhood, and it was just eating me alive. I knew that it wasn't right. I didn't know what to do about it. I thought, well, maybe I could talk with my pastor. And so after a service, I asked if I could talk with him. We were alone in the sanctuary, and he said, sure. And so we sat down, and as soon as he realized where I was going in the conversation, he wasn't a bad man, but he was so uncomfortable and knew nothing about what to say or do. As soon as he realized what I was trying to communicate, he got up and flipped his chair back around and gave me a little pat on the shoulder and said, "You're not doing so badly." And he left. And so I thought, again, there is no hope for me. The church has no answers. God has no answers, because I've been praying to God every night for him to take away these. What I was realizing is, I didn't say this very clearly, what I was realizing is the pornography I was drawn to was men, and the relationships that, I had early on a little bit of interest in girls, but it very quickly became homosexual in nature, and I'd say exclusively so, for sure, for many, many years. And, I knew what the Bible said about that, or at least parts of what the Bible said. And, but yet God was doing nothing. I mean, originally I thought, well, my goodness, I'm going to pray about this and agree with God about it, and I'm going to wake up the next day and be a different boy. Well, of course that doesn't happen. But without someone to talk with, without adults to really talk with through that, we're left in our own heads, which is not good for any of us. And my conclusion was one of two things: either God is powerless to help me, and at the end of the day, I didn't think. I mean, when I saw the miracles and all that in scriptures, I thought that's not true. But He doesn't give a crap about me. That's what's true. So I'm one of these people that Paul writes about, that I'm this chosen vessel that God's going to get glory with by His judgment of me, and that's so I'm screwed basically, and so it was just every day. I mean, I just kind of lived under the weight of that.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back after this message. For years, artists of all sorts, film guys, musicians, muralists, you name it, have been supported by patrons. And it's no different here with Substance TV. Did you know that you can actually financially support us by going to patreon.com/Substance TV? Thanks so much for hanging with us. Now let's go ahead and jump back into the conversation.
When I left, I was eventually kicked out of Bible college because they were concerned I was suicidal, and that understandably that's not the place to process all that stuff. So I went to live with my brother, who had graduated from the same school, co-valedictorian, a couple years earlier, and he's my one sibling who, he really was a good kid. I mean, he really tried to honor mom and dad, went off to Bible college. And so I'm living with him. Everyone's wondering what in the world, back at school, why isn't Garry more like his brother? And when I was living with him, I was living near Cornell University in upstate New York. And I wound up finding out by accident about this a gay club in the area. I'd never had no clue that there was such a thing there. And so I parked my car. I didn't know where it was, but I parked my car in downtown Ithaca and started walking around the streets and walking around everywhere I could think of that it might possibly be. And eventually because there's lots of bars and it's not, readily apparent what bar is what, but eventually I got a pretty good sense of where it was. And it took me weeks to even work up the nerve to go in. I'd never had a drink in my life. And I was 19 years old at this point. And but finally, one day I broke the ice, went in, and every afternoon when I was not working, every afternoon, every evening, I was there. I mean, because I was relationally starving. And that led to me getting involved with a guy that worked there and moving in with him and living with him for about a year or so. But that really began this full identity of I'm a gay man. This is who I am. Getting letters from some of my relatives or communication from them that they were just so ashamed of me and disgusted with me. And, my parents should be so ashamed. And of course they were.
Letters from relatives like that. Wow.
Yeah. And they were Christians. And again, and my favorite, one of my very favorite and close relatives sent me one of the most scathing letters of all. And she loves the Lord and she loves me, but it sure didn't seem like it at the time. But in our ignorance, we can say and do some just amazingly damaging things. Sure. Right.
Yeah, of course.
So,
man.
So from there, I really just embraced this life for quite a while, but my whole, earlier on, my whole desire was to find Mr. Right and settle down for the rest of my life. That was my goal and purpose in life. And, people are pretty naive early on about what's that going to look like, and I can achieve that. And of course, societally, I mean, when you look around and you look at the way that homosexuality is portrayed in media and on TV and that kind of thing, it really looks like white picket fences. It looks like it's as healthy as heterosexual relationships, maybe even more so. And but I can tell you from being there and having conversations with hundreds of people who have been, that really is a ruse. I mean, that's not typically, you'll find your token people that have been together for 20 or 30 years, but in almost every case, in that situation, it's an open relationship. They're bringing somebody else in to their bed as well, just to kind of keep things exciting. And so very quickly, I realized this is not, I don't know how many people I've been with. I mean, it was very quickly getting dumping others. And this desperate, what Melissa shared in her story was this desperate need when she'd break up with somebody to be back in relationship. And I was very much the same way. I felt good about myself when something positive about me was being mirrored to me by somebody else, and in that romantic way. And so but eventually it just took a huge toll, and the Lord was at work in my life, and I was waiting for the Lord to every time I'd leave the bar, I'd think, tonight's the night God's going to kill me. Tonight's the night God's going to kill me. And yep, that didn't happen. And gradually over time, I began to question my perception of him. Is he really the slave master and the ogre that I think he is, or that I grew up, believing he was? And it was in my, I actually bounced around and lived in different places, but I was actually bartending at a gay bar for a while. And then I moved to New Jersey and was in retail down there. And I'd left for a long weekend to come back to New York, to my stomping ground, to party, and all that entails. And that weekend, there wasn't a friend of mine anywhere to be seen. I mean, I reached out by the phone. Either they were out of town, or they were too busy, or there was this or is that. Literally nobody out of this long list of people that I knew was around. And I began to realize, and I was really mad at God, because I realized that he was really messing with interrupting my weekend of fun and all my plans of immorality and all that kind of stuff. And so I left to go back to New Jersey, to this, where I was living at the time. And for some reason, I stopped at this record store, and they had this tiny little area of Christian music. And for some reason, as mad as I was at God, for some reason I bought 2 cassette tapes and Christian cassette tapes. And so I was listening to those on my way back, and kind of very much like Melissa in that experience of the Holy Spirit giving her that window of clarity of that statement, that just because it felt right didn't make it right. And that opened her up to be able to recognize her sin. For me, there was a lyric somewhere in the music that just slew me. So I'm driving on the interstate in New Jersey, and I had become as hard as nails. I didn't cry about anything. I didn't feel much of anything. And all of a sudden, all of the pain started to come up to the surface, and I started to bawl. Well, I couldn't hardly see where I was going. I quickly got over, switched lanes, got over to the side, and parked the car, and I just was sobbing. And finally, for the very first time in my life, I was exhausted and tired. I was in I might have been 20, maybe 21, I don't know, 21, I guess. And I was exhausted, and I felt like an old man. I mean, I felt like I would when Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 6:18 about this idea that the man who sins sexually sins against their own body, that every other sin is outside the body, but the one who sins sexually sins against their own body. There is a unique kind of damage that's done, I think, to our soul.
Wow.
That no other, because lots of sins damage our body.
Yeah. You're saying that gender and sexuality is so primal or core to our humanity that when we violate that design, we actually it has this effect, you're saying?
Oh, I think so. But I think it's, of course, Paul is talking there about not only about gender confusion or about homosexuality, but any kind of sexual sin.
That's right.
Which is outside of God's plan for us and purpose for us. This idea of coming together and being with one person for life is really, as a man with a woman and vice versa, is really God's design for us. And so when we start functioning outside of that design, it does an incredible kind of damage. So I pulled over on the side of the road, and I just, that's the day I got truly saved. That was the day that I surrendered my life to Jesus. And my salvation prayer wasn't this neat little Romans Road thing that I said over and over again as a kid. Right. It was, Jesus, I've made a total disaster of my life. Mm-hmm. I don't even know if you want what's left of me, but if you do, you can have it. Wow. That was it. And so he took me up on her, and life was radically different. I mean, the idea, sin had a whole different perspective. Righteousness had a whole different perspective. I wish I could tell you, oh, it just kept, the smooth sailing from there on out. That's not true. I mean, there was a radical change that happened in my life. I started dating a woman. I started going to church in New Jersey, started spending time with this woman from there, months later, shared my whole story with her. She shared her story with me. And we wound up getting married, and really too soon. And it wasn't, I actually broke the engagement off, and then just feeling pressure, I went back into it and just thinking God'll meet us here, and we'll whatever, it's all going to be okay, which was very ignorant on my part to do. But within three years, we were separated. She left, and not through sexual sin on my part or her part, but she left. And then about a year later, I didn't want the divorce, and so I wouldn't sign the paperwork. I really wanted to work it out, but a year later, the divorce went through, and I was just devastated by that. I mean, it was the last thing in the world I wanted, and out of my anger, I felt like God didn't do enough. God should have done more to apply pressure to her to reconsider, and we were going for counseling, and we were really working on things, and then it was just this sudden kind of shift on her part, and so I went back into homosexuality.
Wow.
But now an experience, because I'm a Christian. I'm not just a religious kid that knew it was wrong and I'm breaking my mother's heart and all this kind of stuff. But now I'm a Christian, and I'm taking the Holy Spirit in everywhere I go and in every experience. And so it was a season for several years of just being miserably addicted. Eventually I kept hearing about this church that was dealing with people that most churches I knew wouldn't have touched with a 10-foot pole. Even really good churches doing lots of great things, they just wouldn't want our kind of folk in their church. And so what's ironic is it was a church back in my hometown that I'd never heard about, and when I lived there, and also I swore I'd never go back to that area again in upstate New York. And so eventually, the Lord led me back to this church, and I emailed the pastor, told him everything I was doing. I was now living in Chicago. I bounced all around the country, from up and down the East Coast. I was in Houston, where I got married, then in Arizona, then back in Houston, then in New York, then back to Arizona, then Chicago. And from Chicago, I was working in outside sales for a plastics manufacturing company. And I sat with my boss, who had come into town to visit customers with me. Thank goodness he's a believer. He was a believer. He's now on our ministry board, actually. And I sat with him, and I didn't want to share what was going on with me, because my life had devolved into adult bookstores and gay bars for my social life. I'm also going to church and trying to break ties, but it was just, as I said, miserably addicted. And so I just said, you know what, I'm dying here, and either you can let me transfer or I'm quitting, because I just can't, I can't do this. And I told him a little bit of what's going on. I started crying, and and because God had been blessing my territory financially and basically doubling it since I'd taken it over, he was able to say, you know what, Garry, you being in the upstate New York area makes no sense for you covering the Midwest and Northeast territories. But because of the financial situation, I feel like I can justify letting you do it, because I don't want to lose you, And so I did. I transferred back to New York, and I started going to this church. I got into a small group right away. I got into counseling right away at the church. And then eventually 3, 4, 6 months later, I don't remember now, I knew that the Holy Spirit was urging me to get involved in their men's group. Well, I don't know if you can understand, but for any dude coming out of homosexuality who grew up in the church and experienced a lot of shame and rejection by the church and by Christian men in particular, and boys, the last place on earth I wanted to be was in a men's Bible study, and put me with women. I'd get them better and they'd get me better. But I knew that was an important part of my healing process. So I went out of obedience. And then several months later, we went to a Promise Keepers conference. And after that, I felt like, well, these guys are never going to be more spiritual than they are at this moment. And so I shared with them, I just named it really just homosexuality and pornography addiction and masturbation. And these are some of the things that I've just been battling with for years and years. And what was so beautiful about that is, I was hoping that no one would leave the room. I was afraid that somebody would get up and just walk out, and they didn't. The leader of the group got up and pulled me out of my chair, and he gave me this huge bear hug and said, "Garry, we are so glad that you're here and you belong with us." Now, I was in my early 30s, wow, and I had never heard those words or experienced that kind of physical affection by anybody in the church, by any men in the church, all of my life. And now, I let me just clarify. God did put a couple of good disciplers in my life in different places that I lived, but it was different to have like one guy that wanted to help and was discipling me. But there was something about having what I needed was the community of men. Like, I belonged in the community of men. And I felt like I was ostracized early on. And then I'm just like, screw y'all, I don't even want to be with you anyway. And so it left me in this weird place where I didn't struggle with transgenderism, but I felt like I was this third gendered thing that didn't fit in anywhere. Yeah. And so the other thing too is I really stayed bonded to my mom and my sister, and my 3 older brothers were old enough. They didn't want me running around with them and their buddies, and so all through my developmental years, I'm marinating in the world of the feminine. I was with girls at school. I'm with girls at church because they were the safe ones. And eventually they're the more interesting ones, to me. And so it was really in my 30s, the very early 30, 31, 32, that I began to feel like the Lord was just really leading me back into a solid place of being a man among men.
Well, there you have it, Substance TV Tribe. Brian and I told you, good stuff with a good dude with an incredible story. In fact, Brian and I, we were just recently talking about how every person's story really matters, right? We've got to make sure that we're telling our story. Our story is a sub-narrative of the great big narrative. And this guy's sub-narrative, his story is setting people free, helping people out in so many ways by just his transparency. And this is just one of 3. We're actually cutting this up. When we sat down, we actually were with him for an hour and a half, just talking about his story and all that he went through. So I'm excited to say that there's another second one, and then there will be a third version of Mr. Garry Ingraham, and so I'm super stoked to show you that. So make sure that you join back next week and the week after that, and then we've got some more good stuff coming up even further than that. We love you guys. Talk to you soon. Some people have asked us, how do we help you grow? Well, you can do that by going to patreon.com/Substance TV and getting more information there.
Thanks for listening to the Substance TV podcast. Subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes to help us spread the Substance TV sweetness. Visit us at substancetv.org to stay up to date with the most current trending topics and events. Is there a topic you'd like to hear on the podcast? Have an opinion and want your voice to be heard? We want to hear from you. Call us at 216-505-0665 or email your questions to info@substancetv.org. See you next time.